Hello, everyone. The time's now 9:03 and we're going to get started. My name is Stephen DiPietro and I'm a project engineer for the City of Guelph and the current chair of the Ontario Public Works Association's membership committee. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Ontario Public Works Association's first ever diversity and inclusion panel discussion, which was organized by the Young Professionals Committee. For the attendees that are not members or familiar with the Ontario Public Works Association, I would like to take a few moments now to talk about the organization. The OPWA is a not-for-profit organization whose mission is to connect public works practitioners. Our organization is the Ontario chapter of the Canadian Public Works Association, the CPWA, and the American Public Works Association, APWA. A membership is made up of professionals who are employed by federal and provincial governments, municipalities, consulting engineers, utility companies, contractors, and suppliers. If you'd like to learn more about the organization or become involved in future events, feel free to check out our website or to reach out to me after this session. Membership contact information will be displayed at the end of today's event. I would also like to take a moment to thank our generous sponsors who make our events possible. Many of the young professionals on the committee are employed by our sponsors, so we thank you not only for your sponsorship, but your continued encouragement to become involved within the OPWA committees. Before we start, I want to remind everyone that the theme for National Public's Work Week this year is Stronger Together. In keeping with this theme, the Young Professionals Committee couldn't think of a better topic for our panel discussion than diversity and inclusion. I'd like to introduce our moderators for today's event. Our first moderator will be Faria Manan. Faria is an engineer who works for the Ainley Group, specializing in transportation projects. She's the current chair of the Young Professionals Committee and is an active member of the Communications Committee. Our second moderator will be Haider Nasrullah. Haider is a professional engineer who works for ADS Canada and oversees all stormwater management projects for the Central and Eastern Ontario. He is the current vice chair of the Young Professionals Committee. Our third moderator will be Tandy Myers. Tandy is a fourth-year civil engineering student at the University of Toronto, currently completing her co-op work term at RV Anderson Associates Limited. In her spare time, she likes reading nonfiction books, playing squash, and the piano. So that's enough talking for me. I'm going to hand it over to our moderators to begin today's event.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm very glad to be hosting this event, and I'm pleased to see that we have a very high interest in it. For today's event, I, alongside Haider and Tandy, will be the moderators. For the panel discussion, we have 5 very well-accomplished industry leaders who have joined us today. However, before we get started, I would like to read out greetings from the APWA Diversity and Inclusion Committee Chair, Kimberly Strong. Stephen, if you don't mind changing the slide. Thank you. So good morning to OPWA Executive Director Brian Barber, OPWA Young Professionals and attendees of this very timely panel discussion during National Public Work Week on equity, diversity, and inclusion. I bring you greetings from APWA's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. I am so very pleased and excited and commend you for your work and involvement as you grow professionally within the organization. As young professionals, you are the future leaders of both CPWA and APWA, and it is refreshing to see that you will be leading us in the right direction. Thank you for your service, continue to be safe, and I look forward to more collaboration with you and your membership in the future. As this year's National Public Works Week theme says, we are stronger together. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for the kind words. We, the YP committee, look forward to collaborating further with you as well. Now, I would like to acknowledge that we are on lands traditionally occupied by Indigenous people. They continue to care for this land. They continue to shape Ontario today, and I want to show our respect. Hundreds of years after the first treaties were signed, they are still relevant today. As settlers, the recognition of contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must also be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across our country. Today, we pay respect to all Indigenous people from all nations across Canada who call Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and or Vancouver their home, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Moving on to the panel event, This event is going to take place in 2 sessions. We will start off with equity, diversity, and inclusion questions for our panelists, and then proceed to final questions, and then conclude with closing remarks. I'd like to note that this event is being recorded, and you will be able to find the recording on our OPWA website. Now, I would like to take a few minutes to introduce our 5 panelists. Our first panelist, Carey Cartwright, is a strategic human resources leader with 20+ years in the professional service industry, with experience in business partner, operational, change management, and center of expertise roles. Currently, Kerri is the Vice President, Engagement and Enablement at WSP Canada, which includes a focus on diversity and inclusion, leadership development, engagement, and talent attraction. Previous to joining WSP, Kerri held several roles at Deloitte, focusing on talent strategy development, workplace transformation, inclusion, and regional talent leadership. Throughout her career, Kerri has demonstrated her passion for building cultures that enable high performance across all businesses dimensions while bringing the best out of people and teams. Our second panelist, Peter Cho, joined RV Anderson Associates Limited, also known as RVA, in 2005. Became an associate of the firm in 2009 and became a principal in 2018. He is a professional engineer with over 16 years of experience managing the design and construction of transportation and municipal projects. Peter received his Bachelor of Civil Engineering from the University of Waterloo in 2005 and joined RVA the same year. Since then, he has been involved in various transportation and municipal projects, including award-winning projects for the City of Guelph, Metrolinx, and the town of Ajax. Our third panelist, Marissa Sterling, is a distinguished engineer and academic administrator. She has 20+ years of experience working and volunteering in the engineering field, in both private and public sectors. Most recently, she has served as the elected Vice President of PEO and is currently the Assistant Dean and Director of Diversity, Inclusion, and Professionalism at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering. Sterling previously worked in consumer products industry in R&D and brand management, and for PEO as Manager of Enforcement and lead of the repeal of the industrial exception. Her extensive strategic and operational stewardship has positively impacted students and engineers. Through the Ontario Professional Engineers Foundation for Education, a charity where she served as president for 8 years, she has helped develop student knowledge and skills. Sterling also advanced EIT leadership development by helping create PEO's G. Gordon M. Sterling Engineering Intern Award, named after her late father, who was also a PEO president. With the advancements of technology, she has been championing the Engineering Change Lab to find ways to transform the engineering community to better serve the people of Ontario. A chemical engineer from the University of Toronto and a member of the Oxford Business Alumni Network, Sterling received the University of Toronto's Arbor Award in 2015, the Engineers Canada Meritorious Service Award for Community Service in 2016, named a Woman of Distinction by the Canadian National Exhibition Association in 2016, made a Fellow of Engineers Canada in 2017, and received the Canada 150th Heritage Pin in 2018. In her spare time, she enjoys being a warden of Camp 1 and annually obligating students and graduates who have the academic qualifications for the PEng license. Our fourth panelist is Max Ross. In 2020, Max retired from his role as Senior Engineer, Infrastructure Projects after 34.5 years with the City of Ottawa, including 26 as Project Manager and Senior Project Manager. After graduating from University of Waterloo in 1984 with a Bachelor of Applied Science Civil Engineering degree, Max worked as a technical support engineer with the Ministry of Natural Resources. 2 years later, Max joined the Regional Municipality of Ottawa-Carleton, the region, working as a planning officer in the Planning and Approvals branch of the Engineering Division. These were the very exciting early days of computer modeling for municipal infrastructure planning. Max was part of the region's team that first implemented computer modeling for assessing the performance of water distribution system components. In 1988, Max moved to the region's operations department as their first distribution systems engineer. He got practical exposure to water distribution operation and maintenance issues by working with the service crews. The service crews took the young engineer under their wing and gave him real-world experience in contrast to planner's view from behind a computer screen. In 1991, Max returned to the engineering division as a design engineer and project manager. His first assignment as project manager in 1991 was a multi-year assignment to manage the digital conversion of water distribution system drawings and related records. This was the initial stage of engineering division's GIS implementation project. Following that assignment, Max found his true calling to be project management of infrastructure capital projects, working in teams, interacting with public and stakeholders, solving problems, building infrastructures, and more specifically, delivering solutions that respond to the community's needs. That's what he really loved doing. Our final panelist, Kelly Elliott, is the Deputy Mayor of the Municipality of Thames Centre and Councillor of the County of Middlesex. She is a director for both Ontario Good Roads as well as the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and sits on various boards and committees at a local level. In her spare time, she is a busy mom of 2 kids and owns her own business. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today. We're going to start this event off by asking each of you your definition of what diversity, equity, and inclusion mean to you and why they are important. So Kerri, if you don't mind starting us off, followed by Peter, Marissa, Max, and Kelly, that would be great. So go ahead, Kerri.
Sure, happy to. So for me, diversity is all about what makes each of us unique. And that's a variety of different things, whether it be your race, your gender, your thoughts, your religion, all sorts of different elements. Equity is to me about creating a level playing field so that all those uniquenesses can kind of come to bear. You know, they're all kind of put on the table. And inclusion is around valuing that uniqueness. It's actually making that uniqueness work together. I often, as likely many, think of kind of the kaleidoscope. It's all those uniquenesses coming together and still being unique, but actually the value of that uniqueness coming together to create greater value. In terms of as to why it's important, I think we can look at it from a couple of different perspectives. Obviously, there's the social aspect of ensuring that everyone has, you know, an equal part and an equal voice to contribute. But also, there's another avenue to look at this from a business perspective, from clients and consumers. You know, more innovation, being more relevant. You know, and I also look at it as, I might say the workforce of tomorrow, but I'd actually say it's actually today. They actually see diversity very differently. If I think of my kids, you know, 15 and 13, they just see inclusion. I mean, they see what makes us different and what makes us unique, but they don't see a very harsh divide. So they expect it in our workforce. They have it in their schooling, and they expect that those conversations are continuing into the workforce. So if we want to be able to attract the right people, then we need to make sure we're having those conversations and it's actually coming to bear in our workplaces.
Oh, thank you, Kerri, for providing a response. Peter, if you don't mind going next.
So the way I look at equality, diversity, and inclusion is kind of making sure that no one feels left out at their workplace. You know, everybody should feel they belong and are accepted where they work and how they work. You know, that's a very general way to explain that. In a way, why is it important to us? Is really important to us because it does give us a broader understanding of what other people's needs and views are, and you know, we make our decisions around all these you know, from these views and opinions that we're given from different types of people. You know, from a statistic point of view, you know, there's a good workplace has shown that, you know, it does increase productivity and efficiency, and I think companies are seeing that too as a benefit, as you know, you probably have less turnover and it's beneficial to from a business side of things. So basically everybody wins here. You know, the business will see a better, you know, better efficiencies, you know, for staff, they see growth in their career and a place that could feel comfortable at work. And for me, I also have a little one too. So, you know, the way that, you know, we want to create a environment that, you know, when we have our younger generation coming into workplace, they feel that they could perform in the way that they want to and express themselves as the way they need it to be.
Thanks, Peter. Could we have Marissa provide some input next? Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. And thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this important panel discussion today. I'm joining you from Toronto, and I just want to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and I'm very grateful to work on their land. I also just really want to thank Sandy, Farida, Stephen, Kimberly, and Brian for putting this together, because these discussions are just super important. Kerri and Peter have given wonderful perspectives on what EDI means to them, and I'll only add by saying that it's about bringing your whole self, right? So in order to be able to do all of our things that we're capable of doing, we need to be able to feel like we can. And so if we have accommodations for certain needs that we need, if we know that we're welcome, if we feel safe, then we are able to bring all of our capabilities forward. And whether that is in a home or work or a community environment, it's important in all of those environments. So that's what it means to me. It means being able to bring your whole self into the environment. Thanks.
Thank you, Marissa. Max?
Hi. In addition to those great responses, quite simply, I believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion means that any person, regardless of race, gender, or religious beliefs, will have the same opportunities for education and employment, including advancement. The significance of it, I believe, is that it's essential for everyone to feel that they are valued members of the community, and that they have an important role to play.
Thanks, Max. Last but not least, Kelly.
Thank you so much. I think it's important when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we don't confuse them all as one thing, and that we don't, when we accomplish one, we don't check all the boxes that we've done everything that we need to do. To me, diversity is just creating that environment where we take the people who have received and still receive to this day the systematic discrimination, and we remove those barriers and we create opportunities for them. And then inclusion, as Kerri mentioned, is taking that environment and making it so everybody in that environment is valued and welcome. So thinking about it, you could throw all your resources into, in my case, I talk a lot about getting more women involved in politics, like I am. So we could throw all of our resources at getting more women to run for elections, but at the end of the day, if they're not respected and not included, we've accomplished absolutely nothing, because they're not going to run in the next election and we're not going to get more women to run. And then when we talk about equity, it's just realizing that and acknowledging that we don't start from the same spot. And when we have those unequal starting places, we need to make the commitments to address that imbalance. And so, for example, using women in politics, again, we know that running for elected positions, we know that women face more obstacles, such as the election system itself, lack of financing, smaller professional networks, childcare, all of those things, as well as the social and cultural barriers from women participating in the political ring. So it's important to tackle, and it's important to tackle these issues. And again, I'll speak from the political side of it, because when we create those environments and we can use those lenses, we make better decisions for our community, and we really build communities that are inclusive and accessible for everyone to succeed in.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you all for your responses. I'd like to have a great understanding of what EDI specifically means to you before proceeding with all the questions regarding EDI. So our first question moving forward is, based on the answers to the above question, Peter, in your opinion, what is the most common mistake people make when they think about diversity?
I think the most common mistake is people think that you understand diversity, but you never actually get the full grasp of it. I believe it's always changing, and it's always changing. And for example, look at what happened to us now, right? For the last year and a half, I think everybody is most of the people have been working from home. There's adapting to different things, and it covers a broad range, and new stuff comes up all the time. So it's almost that you have to keep an open mind and keep working on it. And to think that you know everything is kind of maybe the wrong mentality on this, because you just cannot stop learning about it. And it's challenging, but it's also kind of in a way it's good to see all that, to learn all about all this, right?
Thank you. And Max, do you have a different stance or a similar one?
Well, on a personal level, it's been heartening to see many public works organizations embrace the goal of creating workplaces that are equitable, diverse, and inclusive. But I don't believe we can talk about diversity in public works these days without addressing the underrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people. In workplaces where the underrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people exists, the most common mistake, in my opinion, is ineffective or non-existent measures to recognize and eliminate it.
Thank you, Max. All wonderful questions. Like Faria said, we're gonna get a little bit more into this EDI now that we have a little bit more sense of what it means to all of you. We're just gonna open up this question to everybody. How do we get more companies and workplaces on board with EDI initiatives? And we'll start off with Kerri again here.
This is a tricky one. There's probably a couple of different things I would say. First, I think it is important to really think about the business case. And really, I'll be honest, I'm kind of sick of talking about the business case, because we've been talking about it for years and it really should be evident. But there are some organizations or industries that are further along, so it requires a little bit more patience. But really thinking about it, as a few of us have already said, it's been proven that diversity and inclusion, it drives more innovation, it can drive more sales. If your business is thinking from a risk and a quality perspective, the uniqueness of individuals can actually contribute to those factors. And so we can approach this from two different things. We can approach this from a social approach. And sometimes when we do that, there creates this feeling of, well, if someone is ahead, that means I'm behind. And it feels like there's winners and losers. Whereas if you actually take more of a business case approach, it's more of a collectively together, we're going to win because we're going to up our game in lots of different, metrics and aspects that are important to business. So I would be encouraging and working with organizations to look at the business cases, associated with diversity and inclusion. And I know from my past experience, one of the things that I've also leveraged is harnessing the passion of the people within the organization. Give them a voice to be able to contribute, and it will be amazing, how that passion can kind of rise up and really start having the conversations at the leadership level. And if you have buy-in from the leadership level and you have passion from your people, it tends to, drive and meet in the middle to create some magic from a diversity and inclusion perspective. Those would be my suggestions.
All right, perfect. Those are some very nice ones, Kerri. We'll hear from Peter next.
Yeah, so I think the business case is already there for this, and the main thing I think is getting awareness of it. And sometimes I believe a company might not know what they're missing or what's the missing link are, or the lack of understanding of it throughout. So I think getting the awareness out there and let them let the company find out to do what they're missing and so how they could address it is quite important. And I do agree that it has to the senior leadership is critical to play a role to drive this through. They lead by example. They do this, and they also eventually will build this into the company culture, and it shows up at work every day. And when that happens, then the initiative will keep going and carry on the momentum and keep this going, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a key point you raised about leadership being involved. We'll hear from Marissa next.
Yeah, thanks very much. I agree with all that's been said. I think leadership is critical. And really, in a lot of cases, equity, diversity, inclusion is very personal, right? So it is based on values that we have as we've been socialized through our upbringing, based on the environments and cultures we're living in, based on the environment and culture of our workplaces, for example. And so it's really important, I think, to get companies, workplaces on board is, one, you need the leadership, and two, you need to give everybody in the organization opportunity to explore their personal values and go through their personal journey to come up to a place where they see the value. Because as much as you get, top-down leadership and guidance around and as Kerri said, the business case is well documented. So as much as you kind of have that more cerebral approach about that, and as much as you have sort of leadership and maybe in goals and objectives, really we do the things that we value and we care about. And so it's really important to get in touch with those personal values of each individual in an organization, and for them to be able to come around to a place of why it's meaningful for them. And I hear stories such as, I'm a parent with children and I'm thinking about a better world for my children. I am somebody who has grown up in a marginalized community and I realize the difficulty I've had, and therefore I want to make it better for others. I've gone through some personal, I've had myself an experience that has been very, non-inclusive, and it's been very difficult. And so I have a better understanding of what that's like now, right? So it really ends up being quite personal. And, but those personal journeys can be very difficult and can take a lot of time and need a lot of support. So I think that in addition to having goals and objectives and having folks on board, is to be able to provide the space and the time and the opportunity for everyone in the organization to explore what inclusion means for them, why it could be relevant for them, what it means for them personally, so that they're coming to it from a very personal journey. I think that is an important area to make this most effective. Thanks.
Thanks, Marissa. That's pretty interesting, going from the top-down leadership as well as from a personal level. We'll hear from Max next.
Hi. Well, I'm a firm believer in talking and having that dialogue. It's like a big family. Sometimes the conversation is uncomfortable, but we have to have the conversation. We have to be good at listening and always provide constructive feedback. Where appropriate, we can help by directing questions that we don't know the answers to, or helping the people who are asking questions that we don't have the answers to resources like APWA, who has a great library for diversity and inclusion.
That's good. Yeah, let's move on to Kelly.
Sure. I would say from my experience, a lot of times it's the unconscious bias that stands in the way. And as Peter mentioned, it's that awareness factor, because many organizations and leadership and even other elected officials believe that, they're doing good enough. They're taking everyone into consideration. But when you don't have those voices at the table and you don't apply that lens to the decisions being made, you're really doing a disservice to your community and to your workplace. And not only are you leaving those valuable experiences behind, you're leaving people in your community and in your workplace behind. And you're just continuing in that vicious circle of inequity. And I would just say to those who are, hesitant, not wanting to get on board with EDI initiatives and creating that inclusive workplace, and not only from a public works and a political standpoint, inclusive communities as a whole, again, it's a disservice to those around them. And we really are a better society as a whole when we welcome everyone and we include everyone.
Yeah, that's good to hear. So we've all talked about how we should all get on board with EDI. So just got a follow up here to you guys on a personal level. What is your approach to understanding the perspectives of colleagues from different backgrounds? And we'll hand it off to Kerri again to start us off.
For me, it's really kind of being an active listener and going into the conversation knowing you don't know everything. I grew up in a very small town, not diverse at all, really, from a race perspective. So I realize I don't know everything. And so, it's a fine line of being an active listener and actually taking my own initiative to learn what I don't know. And so whether it be reading articles or videos, what it is not is, asking, the Black friend, as an example, or the person who is gay to explain what life is like. Because then you're placing the onus on the underrepresented person. And so part of it is listening and researching and making myself more aware is a big part that I play.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, definitely like the point about researching it on your own instead of putting the onus on the underrepresented community. We'll hear from Peter next.
Yeah, I totally agree with Kerri. Being open-minded and listening is a big thing. We don't know what we don't know, and sometimes asking the right question, just listening and just absorbing the information you're getting is quite important. And getting these information from all levels or different types of people is quite important. Because you don't want to just hear one side of the story. You want to hear as much as you can and absorb it and learn from it. So, yeah, that's the best way to do it. And there's well Google is always there, so I mean there's a lot of research you get done online, and yeah, that's something that if you're interested, or is that's also generate other questions for you to ask to other people. When you do research, sometimes you find more questions to ask, and having those continuous conversations goes a long way in the long run.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. We can definitely do some more research on our own. Marissa, do you have any input into this? Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I'm on mute.
There we go.
should be better than that by a year, right? I just building on what you've heard, which I completely agree with everybody. They call it inclusive leadership, right? And I think teaching inclusive leadership to folks is really, really important because it involves the active listening, of course. It involves cultural competency. So cultural competency means that you proactively go out and you learn about different cultures and perspectives. So for example, the University of Toronto this summer, I'm leading a program on Indigenous cultural competency where we have a lot of different training, self-learning through reading, video, and so forth, a powwow so that individuals can start to understand and learn the culture. So that's really important. And humility. Humility is so important. If anyone here is an engineer, they know that when they get an iron ring, it's all about realizing that what we know is we don't know is that what we know is that we actually don't know much, right? And so that idea of coming from a place of humility to say that, what can I do? What can I learn? What can I better understand to sort of like, bridge any particular gaps. I think that that's really important. From a personal journey, I mean, I can tell you that I identify as a woman. I use the pronouns she and her. And as somebody who's had a pathway through engineering as my career, quite often I'll hear a comment to say that, well, if we create pathways for women into engineering, then that means that less men have an opportunity to study, get the jobs and so forth, right? So it's a trade-off, right? There's a gain and a loss. So that is, that's a very difficult conversation. But we all know that it is in fact true. So as much as we want to have inclusive leadership and sort of raise everyone up, there is going to be loss. There is going to be giving up some access that others had previously, potentially overemphasized, and trying to make space for others, right? There is loss. And so being able to also acknowledge loss and give people a time to go through and experience the loss, and then see that in fact, society is better when you bring in more representation, is really important. But I think I think that humility, coming from a place of humility, is really important, and really coming from a place of understanding. And, we've just my last comment is we've seen some programs recently, which I think are really interesting in society, around how to deal with violence against women. And the programs are actually about speaking to men and understanding what they're going through and what their experience are. And some people would say, well, no, just, shun them and say that they're bad, what they're doing. But it's more of a compassionate perspective to say, well, what is going on? What is the loss? What is the struggles that you're experiencing? And how do we deal with that and understand that in order to, in the long term, prevent violence against women? So again, it's taking these different perspectives of always starting with compassion first, no matter who we're talking to. But I think that's just a really important point we have to recognize is that some individuals will have to give up what they've been normally accustomed to having because of the fact that there has been inequity, and that is not an easy thing for any of us to go through. And so, being an inclusive leader is hopefully a way to help that happen.
That's great, Marissa. Yeah, especially the point about the loss and making sure everyone's equitable. That's a point that sometimes I feel like is not touched up on a lot as we focus more on the benefits, but it is a conversation we need to have as well. So thanks for that input. We'll open it up to Max here.
Some really great comments. I think the only thing I'd like to add is approaching a conversation, listening with an open mind. Yes, absolutely. Knowing that we don't know the whole picture, and we can only move forward when we provide an opportunity to hear people who are different or who think differently from what we do, and keep that conversation going.
Yeah, perfect. All right, last but not least, Kelly will add your thoughts into this.
Yeah, the problem with going last is everyone has brought up so many good points, but I'll just add maybe just to recognize your privilege as well. So, I speak a lot about, being a young woman in politics and, what I've had to go through and what I still go through to keep this seat and to hold this seat. But at the same time, I recognize, I come from a well-to-do family. I have a great support system. And so there are lots of other women, in the same spot as me, but they've gone through so many other hurdles. So just recognizing the fact of your privileges that you hold, and that not everyone around you holds those same privileges.
Well, thank you everyone for your responses. The key takeaways here, for me anyways, are being an active listener, taking your own initiatives to learn, being open-minded, recognize your own privilege, and understanding there is a loss for others. So moving on, I know Kelly, you had mentioned earlier about an unconscious bias, and Kerri, given your background, the next question is for you. So the question is, nowadays there's a lot of discussion on unconscious bias in the hiring process. As a human resources professional, what steps do you believe should be taken to eliminate bias from the hiring process? What are some creative ways to proactively source candidates from underrepresented communities?
It's the money question, really, to be honest. I think there's probably two things to start. I think one is it's okay to have unconscious bias. It's normal. And it's not a bad thing to have unconscious bias. It's a bad thing to not be aware of that unconscious bias. And for anyone who says, I don't have any bias, I don't believe you, only because, by the makeup of our brain, it's not possible. So being aware, I think, is super key. And in the same vein, I think it's actually really hard to eliminate. I think what we're looking to do is how do we mitigate? If we manage to eliminate, that's perfect, but it's just obviously very challenging to do. When we think about it from a recruitment perspective, there's probably a few pieces I would suggest. One is looking at the diversity of those that are actually in the process, and that are part of bringing that talent acquisition process, together, making sure it's as balanced as possible. So, like, as an example, if you're looking to bring more women into the organization, I would suggest that your whole process isn't full of men, as an example. Making sure you're being really conscious of what roles people are playing. Even if you have, a man and a woman, as an example, in the interview process, don't position the woman as the person who's taking the notes in that interview, because it positions them in a certain way, externally in the market. One of the things that I'm certainly working towards is making sure as hiring managers, they can appreciate the importance of having diverse slates. In some cases where we're seeing the most traction, it is where hiring managers are empowering the recruiters, and in many cases, mandating diverse slates. Don't give me a short list if it all looks the same. I want to see diversity back. Quite often, it's I need people. It's urgent. We need to hire this person right away. So unfortunately, the trade-off with that urgency is to find the thing that's quickest and fastest for them to find in terms of quality, but to give the recruiters the space to be able to, find that balanced skill set. The other piece is data. And the more you can kind of arm yourselves with data in the process of understanding, what does your pipeline look like from a diversity perspective? What do your short lists look like? And then ultimately, what do your hires look like? And are you losing that diversity through the process? And if so, why? And, to have those numbers, it allows you to kind of drill down a little bit further rather than kind of going on gut check. The other piece, which has some mixed reaction to, is the whole concept of blind resume screening. And whether or not does that take the bias out of the process. The challenge is that it will only take you so far, because at some point, the hiring manager, as an example, comes face to face with the candidate. And at that point, some of the diversity will become very visible. And it doesn't necessarily, it creates a bit of a Band-Aid, because at some point, the person needs to be able to bring their full selves to work. And if the bias is there, it's still going to come out. Now, what I like about blind resume screening is it can get them further along in the process than if you didn't have any at all. And so it can get you through kind of a long list and hopefully to the short list, and move things along from that perspective. The other piece to keep in check is actually organizations' employee referral programs. They're great programs. They're an amazing source of talent. I would never suggest turning a referral program off, but what I would suggest is managing the number of candidates that are coming through that process. 25, 30% is what I would kind of say is a best practice. Anything higher than that, you generally are hiring people that look like the people you already have. Especially if you think of, if your own network isn't very diverse, I may only be referring white females. And so just keeping that in moderation, and keeping a watchful eye on that. In terms of sourcing candidates, to me, it's all about strong partnerships. It's around who you are connected with in the in your sphere of influence. So things like university-based employee resource groups, great sources of talent, especially if you're building your organization kind of from the bottom up. Looking at mentoring programs like TRIAC for new Canadians, a great way to get connected to individuals. In some fields, they have very strong returnship programs for women who may have exited the workforce for whatever reason and are now looking to kind of come back into the workforce. And so I think making sure you're partnering with right organizations, whether it be Indigenous professional associations, things like that. There's many of them. Now, it takes time and effort to build those relationships and understand which ones add the most value. But certainly I would start with that. And then the one piece, which is a bit of a no-brainer, but we sometimes oversee it, is you need to market to diverse candidates. So when you look at your job boards or your websites or your career material, things like that, if it's not diverse, your diverse talent is going to be smart enough to know that they need to find a workplace where they can be their whole selves and they'll look elsewhere. So that's certainly one we can all control.
Yeah, well, those are definitely very good points for everyone to consider going forth. But like you said, planning and having that background research and reaching out to the correct locations is key. So now we've got another question for Marissa here. I know you touched up on how some of the programs you guys are implementing at University of Toronto and how you're trying to get promote more of the women in engineering programs in the workforce. But I just want to take that one step back and ask, now many post-secondary institutions are focused on tackling equity, diversity, inclusion problems on campus. What do you see as some of the main challenges to forcing equitable, inclusive, diverse environments, and how universities can overcome them? So we're sort of addressing the problem at the university level before we even get to the workplace.
Yeah, thanks, Peter, for the question. So I love Kerry's answer, by the way. And what is so insightful from Kerry's answer is that equity, diversity, and inclusion strategies are rooted in human resources, right? And so the human resources folks are the ones that tend to lead it, and potentially are the ones that have had the insight, to say that this is important, that we have to evolve and so forth, which is amazing. The challenge we then face is how do we then move it so it's not just in human resources. And so I would say in a university setting, which we also have, a division of HR for staff and faculty, for example, is the challenge is now embedding equity, diversity, inclusion as a core principle and value and strategic objective in all parts of an institution, and not just delegated to human resources. So human resources has the knowledge and the insight, and we need to learn from them. And we need to kind of bring them in to teach us, but that is so important. And so a big message for me is embedding equity, diversity, inclusion into every single thing that's done, and not delegating it, that it's done by a group, a committee, somebody else, right? It's not my responsibility. And so in a university institution, what does that mean? That means that we embed it in the curriculum, right? And what are the challenges? Well, an engineering curriculum in Canada is accredited, right? There's a required curriculum in order to get an engineering degree, for example. And so then there are some challenges around how do you embed this into a curriculum that is sort of dictated by a third party accreditation. And so now that accreditation group in Canada, it's called the CEAB, Canadian Engineering Accreditation Board, they now need to own EDI and embed it within their requirements for the curriculum, for then it to filter down and be in the curriculum in engineering. And then, there might be some more flexibility in some of the sciences, because they may not have that as much of that sort of requirement around accreditation. But the fact is that it needs to be embedded. It needs to be seen as very mainstream and part of everything. Again, we heard about, the pipeline. So pipeline is, again, a challenge in university institutions for a couple of reasons. So one is you have a reputation, right? So companies and provinces and cities and institutions, they all have like a reputation. They all have like a history, right? And so some people will automatically opt out based on what they have heard and they know. And so how do you overcome that in order to even have a pipeline of diverse candidates who would even consider, who would even want to, right? And I think that that's something that we don't always think about. We think, well, we have a pathway, we're going to open up pathways, and as long as we just put out the red carpet, they'll just walk through. And it's like, well, really, if you think about, if you've ever been in a situation where you have not felt that you should be there, you've been invited to a dinner or a party or something, a conference, and you're just not sure, maybe I'm not at the right caliber for this conference. Maybe I shouldn't be here. I'll just sit in the back. Maybe I don't really know anybody. No one really invited me to this thing. So if you've ever had this, you've had the thinking about maybe I shouldn't be here. Well, it's the same thing with any institution. So unless an institution realizes how it's perceived and kind of overcomes that perception, then the red carpet won't bring anyone in, because who wants to put themselves at risk, right? Why would I, as a Black and Indigenous student, want to go to a place where I've heard it's going to be really tough for me? Why would I do that, right? I'll go to the place that sounds like it's much better, right? That people talk a lot about and give sort of positive experiences. So I think that piece is really, really important. So in building pipeline, and opening up pathways. It's not just enough to just sort of say, well, now we have an open pathway, a way for you to come. And so what are we doing at University of Toronto is we're working on that. So for example, we created actually with a lot of other universities across Ontario, we co-created a program to increase the number of Black and Indigenous PhD candidates, because that will help to eventually have more professoriate in the system, so more people can, again, see people that look like them. And in the program wasn't just, here's some funding, apply for the funding, we'll cover you for the next 4 years on your PhD. That's great. Like, that's really a great barrier to remove. But at the same time, that's not enough, because why would they want to come to these institutions? They may be doing phenomenal community work. Why would this PhD be something that they would choose? They have to decide that it makes the best sense for them. It's going to be safe and good for them. So this program is called IBET, and Indigenous Black Engineering and Technology. And this will start in the fall, but in addition to providing full funding and so forth, we are now saying, well, we are making sure that the lab environments are people that are trained and understand how to create inclusive environments. There are going to be protocols. There's going to be all sorts of things in place to make sure that this is going to be an environment that's going to be safe for you, right? So that's just an example of that. So money, that's all you talked about. So money is a good incentive, right? And where have we seen success? So in the research community, because the Canadian government has now said, if you want money from me, then you need to have equity, diversity, inclusion, sort of goals and objectives, and you need to prove it, because you need to show that you're going to have a diverse group of candidates who are going to research with you. You're going to have various activities embedded in your research. And nowadays, you're actually going to think about diversity in your actual research. So if I'm going to research transportation systems, I'm going to be actually looking at gender, because we know that there's gender inequity in transportation. We know that women take public transit and men drive cars. So if we do research on highways, we're actually furthering men versus women. But if we do research on public transit, we're actually furthering women in some marginalized communities. So kind of going beyond, but it's all because of money. It's because if you want to get the federal funding, you've got to have these things in place. So it feels like a bit of a hard stick, but it works. And so trying to, can't be the only thing, it again has to come back to values, but trying to, again, embed motivators that are relevant to the people there. So researchers, what's relevant to them is their funding. So how do you put in place things that require it? And so you can do it with senior management as well, in terms of, in order to meet your goals and objectives, what are your EDI objectives? You can do it with student clubs and say, as a student club, to be a recognized student club within our university and to receive student club funding, what are your EDI goals? And, so you can start to do some of that to kind of raise the bar. There's obviously a lot of different things, but the last one I want to just mention is the fact that one of the challenges is hard work. And this was mentioned by another panelist today, in terms of the easy path is to find a bunch of people who think the same way as yourself. And then you'll just problem solve whatever you need to do. And you'll do it super fast because you're all thinking the same way, right? That's the easy, comfortable process. And so if we want our students to work in design teams and come up with really novel designs, we want them to be, we want them to come from different perspectives. We don't want it to be easy, right? But at the same time, it's going to be hard work. It's going to take more time. It's going to be frustrating. And so how do you support people to do that? Because we all, we're all hard workers, but who wants more hard work? Right? So if we can, and we're even taught, take the, find the shortest way to get the result done, to get your work done, right? So it kind of trying to find some balance to that. So I think it's acknowledging that, listen, and we do this with our students. So in first year, our students go into design teams, and they are put into teams, and the teams are meant to be with quite different backgrounds. And then we say, listen, this may not be easy. You may have these challenges, right? You may disagree, you may have conflict. You may have different working styles. You may have different ways that you communicate. So now we're going to support you with how to work through those challenges, because we believe that end result is going to be even better. And so, for example, this EDI committee that you have here with Public Works is phenomenal, because that's again a support group, so that when people are saying, listen, I'm going through something that's super hard in my office, I'm trying to make some changes, this is the challenge that's happening, you have a place to go, you have a place for help. And I think that that's super important, because what we don't want is people to give up and say, well, I tried and it was so hard, I'm burnt out, I'm exhausted, I give up, right? And we hear that. We hear a lot of people that say that, you know, I tried, you know, for 10 years and it's someone else's problem now. I can't take it anymore. It's so much, it's so much responsibility, right? So I think that support is super critical. And here you have it with what you've created as well for Public Works, which is phenomenal.
Perfect. Thank you, Marissa.
Yes, thank you, Marissa.
Very
You brought
great
up
point.
some really critical points that's really good to keep in mind. Our next question is for Kelly. And so this question is, what type of advice would you give individuals about how they show up in spaces and conversations as they lean into EDI work? Could you share behavior allies should really focus on unpacking as they are learning?
Thanks. And yeah, and I'll start off by saying it can be uncomfortable to look within yourself and really reflect if you truly are allowing others to show up in spaces and conversations when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion. Generally speaking, it's safe to say, I think that everyone on the screen, including myself and those watching, are generally good people, and we want the best for those around us. We want to create the workplaces where people enjoy coming to work and do their best work. We want to create communities where our residents succeed. We want to build infrastructure that is accessible and safe for everyone. So it takes some humility, and Kerry touched on this, to say, you know, I don't know, and to acknowledge that maybe we aren't doing our best. And I'll just use an example, and I think I'm like every other politician who will say that their community is the best and we do everything wonderful for our residents. But last fall, I was actually invited to go on a walk with one of youth in our community named Jesse and his mom, Lisa, and they wanted to talk to me about accessibility. And Jesse is legally blind and he's partially deaf. And so they wanted me to experience what it was like for Jesse just to go out on a walk and navigate his neighborhood. And it was heartbreaking, actually, to go on that walk and to watch Jesse try and navigate it, whether it was uneven sidewalks, if there was cars parked up on the sidewalk, brush from shrubs and trees, or even the braille markers that we put in our sidewalks that didn't really point him in the direction he needed. And Jesse couldn't have his own independence in our community because of simple things that we as leaders had never even considered. And it was, again, it was heartbreaking to know that we had failed someone in our community for just simple things. And so going from there, since then, we're continuously trying to do better. And we've recently here in Thames Centre created an accessibility and inclusivity committee that has the ability to make recommendations to council on what we can do better and how to adapt and change our policies to ensure that we are creating that inclusive community. So what I would say to people to focus on unpacking as you're learning and how to move forward is what Kerry touched on previously, is just not being afraid and being humble enough to say that you can do better, and to open your mind, your ears, and your space for others, and being that inclusive leader to take that one step forward and even implement what you've been learning.
Yeah, that's very insightful there. So our next question is for Peter, and it's, what strategies have you used to respond to diversity challenges or non-inclusive situations in the workplace?
I try to take the approach of really listening to it. I think if there's an issue and there's some things, and you need to listen to it and understand what's going on. We always tell, well, I always teach my son, you know, put yourself in other people's shoes. I think that's very important when it comes to that. And, you know, to have a proper conversation to bring up, to address the issue, you got to understand what the root causes are. And that's the start of it. And being able to communicate to others to help with the situation is also the next thing. Just listening to is not, it's good, it's a good start. And, you know, bringing the issue forward and how to address it to other people that can help address the problem is the next step to do that, right?
Yeah, most definitely.
And I might just add to that. I used to have a leader who used this phrase that has just kind of stuck with me. And I think it really resonates in these sort of situations. And that's to be tough on the problem, not the people. In that, you know, 9 times out of 10, it's an awareness issue. There is no ill intent in terms of the situation playing out. And now sometimes there are, don't get me wrong, but 9 times out of 10, it's an awareness piece. And so I think even, framing the conversation from an I perspective rather than a you perspective can help kind of deflate certain situations. And, no different than, how we were talking about privilege earlier is, if you are in a position of privilege in that meeting, it could be, there's, many of you in terms of that look like you. It could be that you're the most senior. It might be that you have the most expertise in the topic. Is how do you give space for those that don't? And, in these sort of situations, actions speak louder than words. And so making sure that, if someone's being talked over, which is a very common non-inclusive situation, is to just very delicately say, I think so-and-so actually had an important point to raise, or, that's a great idea that you've brought forward. I think Sally had a similar suggestion earlier, and, just making those connections and subtly bring awareness to the situation.
Yeah, I think that's key, especially sometimes, you don't feel representative. Somebody definitely stands up for you. It all of a sudden makes you believe, that you're valued and you belong. So our next question here is for Max, and it's how has diversity played a part in your career? And has diversity played a role in shaping you into the professional you are today? If so, how?
I think I'm on mute. Oh boy. Delicately, when I began my career, the workplace was quite different from what it is. And I'll just say that diversity has really helped with the softening of attitudes and making the workplace a more welcoming and inclusive place for me personally. I think we'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Max. I know Tandy had a couple questions for the panelists as well. So Tandy, if you're able to turn on your video and mic, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Fariha. So the final questions that I was going to ask were, we spoke a lot about various things. We had a lot of questions about EDI, but is there something in regards to EDI that nobody ever asked you and you'd like to be asked? So we could start with Max.
Yeah, I really got to get better at unmuting my mic. Funny, it's only after I retired and I got these great questions that I actually thought about this one. I've never been asked about my experiences as a Black man in my workplace, or about my thoughts and ideas about how to improve diversity for people who look like me.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Max. We could go with Kelly next.
Sure, this is a tough one to ask because I think from my perspective, at least, there's been a huge push in getting more women involved in politics. And so I would say, I was 27 when I first ran for council. So this is my second term. And when I first ran, there wasn't that. Those conversations weren't really happening on how to get women and young people in politics. And now, with the potential of 3 elections here in Ontario next year, there is that huge push and the conversations and the questions about how do we make spaces safer? How do we get more women to run? How do we open up those spots? How do we break down the barriers that women are experiencing have become, you know, the center of a lot of conversations. I just did a panel on Monday evening for a neighboring county on how to encourage women in their county to run. So I think that, you know, if I would have answered this question a few years ago, there would have been a lot more, but I think, you know, people are really starting to, and as a society as a whole, we're starting to recognize the value of bringing diversity and inclusivity to our workforces and specifically into politics.
Thank you, Kerri. That was very insightful. Next, maybe Marissa, you could take a shot at this question.
Absolutely. How are you and can we do better? Or how can we do better, right? Like, do we really ask those questions and do we really want to know the answer? And are we going to do anything with that answer, right? So I can tell you that, you know, when I was in high school, I was, you know, thinking what to do for university, and I didn't know about engineering, knew nothing about it, but my parents introduced me to engineering. I'm like, oh, okay, this sounds great. And so when I looked into it further, I thought, oh, this is great. I want to do mechanical engineering. This would be super awesome. I want to, you know, learn how a car engine works, and I want to just like be able to work with my hands. And then people said to me, no, you should take chemical engineering. It's better for you. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess you know better, right? So I took chemical engineering and it was great. But nobody sort of said, you know, I'm guessing the reason why they did is because they knew, like when in my years of university, there was no women in the mechanical engineering course, like in the particular year that I graduated, right? So maybe people knew that, hey, you know, you're gonna be the only woman, and likely, and how this might be challenging or not, and what you might want to think about. No one had that conversation with me. They just decided for me, you know, with the best of intentions, to say, don't consider that one, pick this one, because chemical engineering had 15% women, and I guess that was really obvious to them. So I think, you know, we don't want to solve things for other people. We want to empower people, right? And that's really important. So we need to ask questions and provide ways for people to empower themselves and make their own decisions, versus try to think that we're going to do the best and protect them, and therefore we're going to suggest what is the best thing for them, right? I think that is like the well of intention, but not the best likely outcome by doing that, right? So instead, arm folks with information and what to consider and what they could put in place to help them, and then they can decide what they want to do, right? And so if it's for running for politics, for example, it's the same thing. Just be really obvious, like clear. Raising money is going to be super hard. You may be seen in a certain way. You may be seen as too loud, as too strong, as too weak, as too quiet, whatever. So let's arm you with those things, and then decide if you want to be there. You'll get a lot of public scrutiny if you don't, you know, so at least you're aware of it and make the decision, versus saying this isn't the right thing for you, right? My 2 cents.
Thank you, Marissa, for sharing. I totally agree. Empowering people is very important. And I guess we'll go with Peter next, and then we'll end with Kerri.
So I think one thing that that's never been asked to me is people ask what they can do to help with the organization with the EDI. You know, I have a lot of people asking me about my career, how I might get to this point. You know, how you know, how tough it was to get to this point, or, you know, what is the path? But I think sometimes, you know, the missing piece is asking what they can do at different levels to help the company to achieve the goals of some of the EDI initiatives that the company wants, or bring up new ideas. You know, surprisingly, that has never been brought up at different levels, at least to me, maybe to other staff, but I have never got asked that question. What can they do to help the company with our EDI initiatives within the company?
I think I'm up next.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Peter. Kerri, you can go next.
So I would say, especially as a HR person, and I loved how Marissa had said, you know, D&I often gets rooted in HR. And it's actually a bit of a bugbear of mine, because I believe it needs to sit at the leadership and strategy level, and then we help kind of disseminate it and work with the business to get it across the organization. But the question of how do we know when we've achieved this diversity and inclusion equity piece? Like when are we going to get there? And I would say we don't ever get there. I think it just keeps evolving. It's funny, when I first started out in HR, I started by in an HR role. I was, analyzing the feedback of a session around men and women and how they work together. That was over 20 years ago. And you can see how things kind of evolve, and in some respects still stay the same. But I think we will, continue. If it's not, something else, it's something. It's another piece, that we need to be focusing on. We're talking today about, racism more than we ever have been, which is amazing, and it's exactly what we should be talking about. And then that will evolve into other conversations, and it's more, we have to keep having our degrees of willingness to get uncomfortable will shift, and it will cause us to keep thinking differently. And I think especially in the space that we're working in, as we're looking to make communities thrive, there's always another thing that we can be looking at to make sure that we're creating those environments that allow that to do that. We would have never. I was involved in a workplace redesign project, which was probably the highlight of my career. We would have never been talking about the bathroom design 10 years prior. And so it just continues to evolve, which I think is the exciting piece. So we're never going to get there. And that's part of the exciting. It's you're just going to evolve, just like your business strategy, it will evolve with it.
Thank you, Kerri. And yes, I agree that equity, diversity, and inclusion is a long learning process. There's no real end, and therefore that's really why it's important. And final question that I have here is, if you had to make one rule that all leaders in industry must follow, what would it be? And I think I would start with Kelly this time.
Thanks, Sandy. So mine was just to develop those strategies where those voices can be heard. So as I mentioned, here in Thames Centre, we approved the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and that committee is made up of council representatives, including myself, municipal staff, and as well as community members, to ensure that we're bringing those lenses and experiences to the table. But we just approved that last month. I really wish, it was mandatory for municipalities to implement a committee like this, and that we did it, 7-10 years ago, because we really have, as a community, haven't done everything we can do. And if we would have started a long time ago, we wouldn't have kids like Jesse, who, have had trouble in our community. And so it would be to develop the strategy where those voices can come to the table, and however that looks in your workplace or your municipality.
Thank you, Kelly. Marissa?
Sure. The rule is to be able to answer the question, how do you know that you have created an inclusive environment or inclusive team or inclusive project or whatever it is the person's working on? And so to drill that down a little bit, it's about being able to state what did that team or did that individual personally actively take as steps towards that goal. And so when we think about, so we've talked a bit about how the conversation in society this last year has been raised around racial tendencies, for example, right? But if you want to be anti-racism, that means you're actively doing something about it. You're not reading about it, you're not learning about it, you're not just becoming more aware. You're actively taking steps to combat it, right? That's anti-racism. And so I think the rule or the request would be, what steps are you, your team actively taking to deliver, to know that you have created an inclusive team, inclusive project, inclusive strategy, etc. And I think there's a lot that would be coming from that, in terms of, you obviously have to talk to your client base or whoever it is to see, because they decide, to see what they need, you know, and then take active steps. I think that would be the message I would like to deliver.
Thank you, Marissa. Max, we'll hear your take.
Well, in the 90s, we saw the beginning of a major campaign to hire women into roles that were historically held by men. In addition to making the workplace safe and inclusive, that campaign included outreach with schools to promote engineering and public works as career opportunities for women. In the years and decades that followed, we saw significant improvements. In my workplace, I witnessed a transition from very few females, and I mean one or two, to female engineers in all areas of public works, including the highest level of management. In answer to the question, I would ask all leaders to apply the same kind of effort and commitment that went into eliminating the underrepresentation of women in public works, to eliminating the underrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people in all areas of public works.
Agreed, and that contributes to the idea that the work of EDI never stops. Peter, and then we'll go with Kerri last.
So I believe one rule that I'll make for the leaders will be is lead by example. I believe if you're going to be believing in this, you have to do it. You have to do it yourself. You have to demonstrate that. There's a reason why, you know, he or she is the leader of the industry, and people gravitate. People see what we do. People will follow if you demonstrate that. You know, it's one thing to have the initiative on paper, but not follow through with it and not act on it. And I think that's really important to show that and demonstrate that to others. You are following through with what kind of goals and what you're setting for not just yourself, but probably even for your company.
Thank you, Peter. Leading by example, it never fails. Kerri, your turn.
Super hard to do this one last. So I take everyone else's rules and then I'm going to add one for mine. I'd like to see everyone needing to create a level of awareness as a base point, as a starting point. So I would start with unconscious bias training. But I would also ask that with that, people always have what I'll call a person in kind of a challenger role. So that person can always kind of hold that mirror up to you and kind of say, are you sure, you know, that they're aware of what that bias is that you hold? Be open about it. You know, put your bias on the table and let others hold you accountable to that bias, and kind of continue to create, you know, the awareness in everything that you do. It's not it doesn't sit over here. It should be in everything you do every day. So if you're thinking about, you know, hosting a meeting, how are you going to show up inclusively? If you're thinking about designing a bridge, how are you doing that inclusively? Everything we're actually doing every day should have that thought process. The federal government actually has a very good program. It's a free, I think it's 90 minutes. It might be 2 hours, but it's a 90-minute program on gender-based analysis plus. The plus meaning it's not just about gender, and it's all actually about how do you embed inclusivity in what you do every day. So how do you approach it with that lens? It's a fantastic program as a starting point. It's not the end all and be all, but it's a good place to start in building awareness.
Well, thank you, everyone. Those are great. And I just wanted to also ask Hayder, as a young professional, I want to get your perspective on this question. So if you had to make one rule that all leaders in the industry must follow, what would it be?
Oh, like Kerri said, it's really tough to go last on a question like this, but
Put you on the spot.
Yeah, just put me on the spot right there. But just to sum it up, like everyone said, you know, be open, be understanding, be vulnerable, be willing to learn, be a leader, not a boss. You know, I've worked in different places throughout Ontario now, and I've had the pleasure of working with wonderful people. And all of my, you know, leaders, supervisors, they were all very understanding in every aspect. You know, they understood the importance of a diverse workplace. So again, the one rule, like everybody said, is understanding that this is something that we have to continuously learn and improve on. And it's just being vulnerable, being open to having that discussion is the one rule I would say that, you know, a lot of young professionals would benefit from in the workplace to be more accepted in there. But yeah, overall, I think everyone's, you know, like I said, I've had the pleasure of working with great people, and we're on the right path, you know, in the last few years in terms of EDI in the workplace.
Well, thank you, Hader, and thank you for taking the last question there. So thank you, and thank you, panelists, very much for your responses and for finding the time for this panel event. I found it very interesting and insightful, and I hope the attendees have also found this event interesting. Equity, diversity, and inclusion is such an important topic, and together we can make a positive difference. As this year's National Public Works Week theme says, we are stronger together. There's so much to cover, and honestly, 1.5 hours really is not enough. And we tried our best to squeeze in as many questions as we could, but I hope everyone was able to take away some insight. And this is an ongoing topic that needs to continue, and I really hope everyone will continue to do so. Lastly, I wanted to thank OPWA committee members that worked extremely hard in putting this event together over the last few months. And thank you, attendees, for taking the time to attend this event. We hope you enjoyed it. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Very much.